The well-dressed black man stepped onto the porch of Bellamy Plantation at twilight on September 3, 1857, and the old master extended his hand without the slightest flicker of recognition. Richard Bellamy had forgotten many things in his 62 years: debts, promises, the faces of the enslaved people he'd sold downriver when cotton prices fell. But forgetting this particular face would cost him everything. The stranger's grip was firm, confident, the handshake of an equal. Something Bellamy would have found absurd 12 years earlier when this same hand was small and calloused, picking cotton in his fields. The evening air hung thick with magnolia and coming rain. Bellamy smiled, mistaking the stranger's intensity for business ambition. He had no idea he was shaking hands with his own son, the son he'd sold for $800 to pay a gambling debt. The son who'd spent 12 years planning this exact moment, building the perfect trap, sharpening the blade of revenge into something far more devastating than a knife, the law itself. What happened over the next 6 weeks would prove that sometimes the cruelest vengeance isn't violence, it's truth. But to understand how a father could sell his own child and forget, we need to go back. Back to when Thomas wasn't a name at all, just a number in a ledger. Back to 1833, when Clara was 19 years old and had no choice in anything. Clara worked in the main house at Bellamy Plantation in northern Georgia, a sprawling estate of 2,000 acres and 97 enslaved people. She moved through the rooms like a ghost, visible only when needed, scrubbing floors that would never be clean enough, serving meals she'd never taste. Her hands bore the permanent scars of lye soap and scalding water. Richard Bellamy had inherited the plantation from his father at age 26, along with the casual cruelty that came with absolute power. He wasn't the worst master in Georgia. He didn't whip people for sport or separate families for entertainment. But he also wasn't burdened by empathy or moral doubt. Enslaved people were property, investments that either appreciated or depreciated, until Clara caught his attention on a humid August night in 1833. Not because she did anything wrong, just because she was there, because he could, because the law said she couldn't refuse. The plantation records from that era are preserved in the Georgia Historical Society archives, though they tell their story in euphemisms and silences. There's an entry in Bellamy's personal diary from September 1833 that reads simply, "Clara to be kept in main house indefinitely." His wife Margaret made her own notation in a letter to her sister dated December of that year, coldly clinical. She wrote, "The house girl will be unsuitable for public-facing duties by spring." Richard insists she remain for reasons of household efficiency. The word slithers off the page. By April 1834, Clara was visibly pregnant. When Thomas was born in May, he was registered in the plantation ledger as Clara's boy with an estimated value of $50. No father listed, never a father listed. Richard Bellamy looked at the infant once, noted the child's complexion, and walked away. He never claimed Thomas, never publicly acknowledged him. But he also never sold Clara, which in the twisted logic of the plantation was its own kind of admission. Thomas grew up in the shadow of the main house, learning to read by stealing Margaret Bellamy's old newspapers from the trash, teaching himself letters by candlelight while his mother stood watch. This was illegal. Georgia law prohibited teaching enslaved people to read, punishable by whipping. But Clara understood that knowledge was the only inheritance she could give her son. By age 10, Thomas could read better than many white children in the county. He watched his father from a distance, the man's gait, his mannerisms, the way he conducted business. Thomas had his father's jaw, his height, his quick mathematical mind. Everyone on the plantation could see it. Margaret Bellamy saw it every time she looked at him, her mouth tightening into a blade. Richard Bellamy saw it too, but filed it away with other uncomfortable truths, ignored, unexamined, and ultimately catastrophic. Then everything changed in the summer of 1845, when Thomas was 12 years old and cotton prices collapsed. The financial panic that swept through Georgia that year drowned estates in debt and forced desperate men to liquidate their assets. Richard Bellamy had gambled heavily on cotton futures, borrowed against projected harvests, lived beyond his means. When the bottom fell out, his creditors came calling. The plantation books from July 1845 tell the story in neat columns of ink. Debts exceeded liquid assets by $43,000. Bellamy needed cash immediately, and in the slave economy, cash meant selling people. On the morning of August 12, 1845, a slave trader named Moses Whitfield arrived with an empty wagon and a full purse. He was a lean, weather-beaten man who smelled of tobacco and sweat, the kind of predator who'd built wealth on other people's disasters. He walked through the quarters examining people like livestock, checking teeth, squeezing muscle, asking ages. Thomas stood with his mother in the yard as Whitfield approached. Clara gripped her son's hand so hard it hurt, a desperate silent prayer compressed into flesh. Whitfield looked Thomas up and down with practiced eyes. He noted the boy's height, his clear eyes, his straight back. $800 for a healthy 12-year-old male. Richard Bellamy didn't hesitate, didn't look at Thomas's face, didn't see his own features reflected there, or if he didn't care. He saw $800 toward his debt. He nodded. The transaction took less than 3 minutes. Clara screamed. It was an animal sound, the sound of something vital being torn away. She tried to run after the wagon but was restrained by the overseer, held back as the wheels began to turn. Thomas looked back once, locking eyes with his mother, and she saw in that moment that he was memorizing everything. His face wasn't crying, it was calculating. Richard Bellamy watched the wagon roll down the Oakline Drive and felt nothing but relief. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined, was that the boy in that wagon was compiling evidence. Mental testimony. Names, dates, faces. Every humiliation, every cruelty, every moment of paternal abandonment was being filed away in a mind that would survive what came next. Because what came next was Mississippi. The journey south took 11 days. A nightmare of chains and heat and human suffering compressed into space designed for cargo. When they reached Natchez, Mississippi, Whitfield sold his cargo at auction. Thomas brought $900. His buyer was a plantation owner named Josiah Dryden, and if Richard Bellamy had been indifferent, Dryden was actively malicious. The Dryden plantation was a factory of brutality. 6,000 acres of cotton worked by 200 enslaved people under a system designed to extract maximum labor through maximum fear. Thomas learned this in his first week when he saw a man whipped for working too slowly. 39 lashes, administered with mechanical precision while other workers were forced to watch. The man's back opened like a mouth. Thomas watched, silent, learning the geography of power. He worked the cotton fields from dawn to dusk, his hands bleeding from the sharp bowls, his back aching, his mind focused on a single question: how do I get out? Over the next 6 years, Thomas did 3 things simultaneously. First, he survived. Second, he observed. He watched how the plantation economy functioned, who held power, what laws governed the system, where the weak points were. Third, he planned. Because one night in 1849, lying in the dark listening to someone crying in the next cabin, Thomas made a decision. He would not die enslaved, and when he got free, not if, when, he would destroy the man who'd sold him, not with violence. Violence was the language of the powerless, and it always failed. No, Thomas would use the master's own tools. Law, property, the machinery of power itself, turned against its creator. The break came in 1851 when Josiah Dryden died suddenly, and his estate descended into chaos. Thomas had been working as a house servant by then, trusted enough to handle paperwork. During a trip to Natchez to deliver documents to an attorney, Thomas did something extraordinary. He walked into the law office of Samuel Heath, a rare and dangerous creature in Mississippi, a white abolitionist lawyer who worked for the Underground Railroad. Thomas found Heath's office in a narrow brick building that smelled of pipe smoke and old paper. The secretary tried to turn him away, but Thomas looked him in the eye and said 5 words that changed everything. "I can pay you later." He had no money. He had nothing. But he had something Heath recognized immediately: determination, intelligence, the kind of raw capability that could shatter the myth slavery depended on. Heath listened to Thomas's story for 2 hours, then made a decision that could have gotten both of them killed. He would help Thomas escape and get an education. In return, Thomas would work for the abolitionist cause. Thomas agreed without hesitation. Over the next 2 years, Heath created forged documents stating that Thomas had been manumitted. He arranged for Thomas to be smuggled north to Ohio. In October 1853, Thomas crossed into free territory for the first time in his life. He was 19 years old. The next 4 years were a sprint through every form of knowledge Thomas could absorb. He enrolled in Oberlin College in Ohio, one of the few institutions that accepted black students. He studied law, economics, history. He worked 3 jobs to pay tuition, slept 4 hours a night, drove himself with single-minded intensity. They thought he was just ambitious. They didn't know he was building weapons. By 1857, Thomas had graduated, passed the bar in Ohio, and accumulated enough money to present himself as a successful free black businessman. It was time to go home. If hearing this makes your blood boil, if you can feel the calculated cruelty of a man selling his own child without a second thought, then hit the like button and write in the comments, "He remembered." Because while the master forgot, the son spent 12 years making sure he would never forget anything. Not a single detail, not a single debt. Stage rolled into Liberty County, Georgia in late August 1857, and Thomas stepped off wearing clothes that cost more than some people earned in a year. He changed his name to Thomas Freeman, Freeman being both a statement and a bitter joke. He was a northern investor interested in purchasing land in Georgia. He had letters of introduction, forged documents attesting to his financial standing, and an air of educated confidence that white Southerners found both unsettling and impressive. Free black people with money complicated the racial narrative slavery depended on. He spent 2 weeks making himself visible, staying at the best hotel, eating in public establishments, conducting business openly. He asked questions about land values, local plantation owners. He mentioned casually that he'd heard the Bellamy estate was well managed. Would Mr. Bellamy be interested in discussing business? The word got back to Richard Bellamy within a week. Bellamy's first instinct was refusal, but his financial situation hadn't improved much since 1845, and this Freeman fellow supposedly had capital. So Bellamy sent word that he'd be willing to discuss matters. Thomas received the invitation on September 2nd. He read it 3 times, feeling something cold and sharp settle in his chest. The next morning he rode out to Bellamy Plantation as the sun lowered toward the pines. The Oak Line Drive was exactly as he remembered, except this time, Thomas wasn't in chains. He was carrying documents that would destroy that kingdom from within. Richard Bellamy waited on the porch. Their hands met. Bellamy looked directly into Thomas's eyes and saw nothing familiar. Not a flicker of recognition. Thomas had grown 6 inches since age 12, but more than that, Bellamy simply wasn't looking for his son. The cognitive category, my enslaved offspring who I sold, didn't intersect with free, educated northern black businessman. His brain couldn't make the connection, so he saw a stranger. Bellamy gestured toward the door. "Shall we discuss business, Mr. Freeman?" Thomas nodded, stepping into the house where his mother had been assaulted by the man now offering him bourbon. Bellamy began his pitch. The plantation was profitable, well-positioned, ripe for expansion. Thomas listened, nodded, asked intelligent questions. He expressed interest but said he needed time to evaluate. Could he stay in the area for a few weeks, examine the books, tour the property? Bellamy agreed enthusiastically. Over the following weeks, Thomas became a fixture at Bellamy Plantation. He reviewed financial records, walked the fields. He also talked to the enslaved people quietly, carefully. He found his mother. Clara was hanging laundry when Thomas approached, introducing himself as Mr. Freeman. She looked at him politely, seeing nothing. Then he spoke a single sentence in a voice so low only she could hear. "Mama, it's Thomas." Her hands froze on the wet sheet. Her eyes went wide, searching his face, and suddenly she saw him, the boy she'd lost, now a man. She swayed and he caught her arm. "Don't react," he whispered. "Don't let anyone see. I'm going to fix this. Trust me." That night, Clara told the other enslaved people what had happened. The boy who'd been sold had come back, not for revenge or not just for revenge, for liberation. Over the next 4 weeks, Thomas executed his plan with surgical precision. He went through every financial document Bellamy possessed. He discovered patterns of illegal activity that were shocking even by plantation standards. Bellamy had been underreporting crop yields to avoid taxes. He'd been engaging in illegal slave trading across state lines. He'd defrauded creditors through false bankruptcy declarations. He'd bribed local officials. Each crime was meticulously documented in Bellamy's own hand. Thomas copied everything. He also gathered testimony from enslaved people, names, dates, specific incidents of abuse. And he made one more discovery, buried in old correspondence. Letters between Richard Bellamy and his wife from 1834, discussing Clara's pregnancy with cold clinical detachment. One letter in particular, dated June 1834, in which Bellamy acknowledged to his wife that the child was his but insisted it made no difference. "The boy is property regardless of blood," he'd written. "Margaret may rest assured I have no intention of sentimentality, interfering with practical management." Thomas made copies of every letter. By early October, he had everything he needed. He'd built a legal cage so comprehensive that Richard Bellamy couldn't escape it. Now it was time to spring the trap. On the evening of October 14, 1857, Thomas requested a private meeting with Bellamy, just the two of them over bourbon. Bellamy assumed this was the final negotiation. He was already counting the money. Thomas sat across from him, studying the man who'd sold him. Then he set down his glass and began to speak. "Mr. Bellamy, I need to tell you something about who I am." Bellamy frowned, confused. Thomas continued, voice steady. "My name is not Thomas Freeman. It's Thomas. Just Thomas. I was born in this house in May 1834. My mother is Clara, your house servant. You sold me in August 1845 to Moses Whitfield for $800. You never recognized me then, and you don't recognize me now. But I recognize you. I've recognized you every single day for 12 years. The color drained from Bellamy's face. He stared at Thomas, his brain struggling to reconcile the educated man before him with the child he'd sold. "It's impossible," Bellamy whispered. "You're lying." Thomas reached into his leather case and pulled out a thick sheaf of documents. He slid them across the desk. "Here are your ledgers from July 1845. Showing the sale of 8 people, including a 12-year-old male from Clara's cabin. Here are tax records showing you underreported crop yields by 30%. Here are bills of sale proving illegal interstate slave trading. Here are sworn affidavits from 17 witnesses detailing violations of Georgia law. And here are letters you wrote to your wife acknowledging that I am your biological son, and that you chose to keep me enslaved and eventually sell me despite that knowledge." Bellamy's hands shook as he picked up the papers. He read them with growing horror, recognizing his own handwriting, his own signature. Thomas leaned forward. "I am an attorney, Mr. Bellamy, licensed to practice in Ohio. I have copies of all these documents deposited with lawyers in 3 states. I've also filed preliminary complaints with Georgia state officials. Unless you cooperate, those complaints will become formal criminal charges. You will face prosecution. You will lose this plantation. You will very likely face imprisonment. And the public scandal of a slave master being destroyed by the son he sold will be printed in every abolitionist newspaper in the North. Your name will become a symbol of everything evil about this system." Bellamy's face had gone from white to gray. "What do you want?" he rasped. Thomas cut him off. "I don't want your money. I want justice. You are going to sign over 50% ownership of this plantation to my mother, Clara. You will file manumission papers for every enslaved person on this property, effective immediately. You will provide each freed person with enough money to relocate. You will sign a confession detailing your illegal activities, which I will hold as insurance. And you will do all of this tonight with witnesses present." Bellamy stared at him. "And if I refuse?" "Then tomorrow morning," Thomas said calmly, "I file criminal charges. The state seizes your assets. You lose everything anyway, but you also go to prison. This way, you keep half the plantation and your freedom. It's more than you deserve and far more than you gave me. Stop, pause, take time to think. If your world has just been shaken a little, if you're realizing that the cruelest revenge isn't violence but using the master's own laws against him, hit like and show that you're moving toward the truth. Show that you understand what Thomas built with his survival. Bellamy sat in silence, the weight of the trap settling on him. He looked at Thomas and finally truly saw him, saw the boy he'd sold, saw the son he'd denied, saw the man who'd outsmarted him so completely that there was no escape. He'd been played from the moment Thomas stepped onto his porch. Every conversation, every moment of trust had been part of a plan 12 years in the making. "You have 1 hour," Thomas said. "After that, I file the charges." He stood and walked out to find his mother. Clara was in the kitchen when Thomas entered. "It's happening," he said quietly. "In less than an hour you'll be free. You'll own half this plantation. He'll have no power over you ever again." Clara's legs buckled and she gripped the edge of the basin. "Is it real?" Thomas crossed the room and embraced her the first time in 12 years. "It's real, Mama. I promised I'd fix it." Other enslaved people began filtering into the kitchen, sensing something momentous. Thomas turned to address them. "By midnight tonight, you will all be free, legally free with papers. Mr. Bellamy is signing manumission documents for everyone on this plantation." 63 minutes later, Thomas returned. Bellamy sat hunched in his chair, a bottle half empty beside him. "I'll do it," he said, voice hollow, "but I want you to know that you've destroyed me." Thomas felt no satisfaction, only cold certainty. "You destroyed yourself," he replied, "when you decided your own blood was worth $800. Now sign." The rest of the night was a blur of paperwork. Thomas had brought 2 attorneys from the county seat. Bellamy signed document after document, each stroke dismantling his empire. Ownership papers transferring 50% of the plantation to Clara. Manumission papers for 93 people. Financial agreements providing each freed person with $50. A confession sealed with Thomas's attorneys to be opened if Bellamy ever attempted reversal. By dawn, it was done. Clara was a landowner. 93 people were free. Richard Bellamy was financially crippled and legally bound. Over the next few days, the freed people began making decisions. Some left immediately. Others chose to stay, negotiating wages with Clara, who had become their employer. Thomas stayed for 3 weeks, helping establish the new arrangements. He worked with Clara to understand the finances, hired a business manager. The white community exploded in fury when word spread. But Thomas had built his legal fortress well. The documents were airtight. Bellamy had signed voluntarily, witnessed by white attorneys. The property transfer was legal under Georgia law. The confession Thomas held kept Bellamy from testifying against the arrangement. The system was trapped by its own rules. Richard Bellamy never recovered. He lived like a ghost, watching the woman he'd enslaved now run the plantation. He saw his former property become people with wages. He watched his son become a successful attorney and abolitionist speaker in the North. Bellamy drank heavily, withdrew from public life. His wife left him in 1858. Bellamy died in November 1860, alone in his study, from what the doctor called a stroke, but what everyone understood was a broken will. He'd been destroyed not by violence, but by being forced to confront the humanity of the people he'd treated as things. They wanted you to never find this out. They wanted Richard Bellamy's story to be one of a respectable plantation owner, not a man who sold his own son and was destroyed by that son's brilliance. They wanted Thomas to disappear into statistics. But now you know. Now the power is in your hands. Hit like and show that you are not afraid. Show that you want more people to know that systems of oppression can be defeated by those they try to crush. Write in the comments, he remembered. If you understand that memory is resistance, that refusing to forget is its own form of warfare. Thomas lived to see the Emancipation Proclamation and the end of slavery. He died in 1901 at age 67, having spent his life fighting for freedom. Clara ran her half of the plantation until 1866, then moved north to be near Thomas. She used the money to fund schools for formerly enslaved children. She died in 1878, surrounded by family. What Thomas did was more than personal revenge. It exposed the central lie of the slave system, that enslaved people were naturally inferior. He proved that given the chance, black people could excel beyond their oppressors. He used the master's legal system to liberate nearly 100 people, without violence, without giving the white community any excuse. He was undeniable proof that the entire ideology of slavery was a lie. This story was suppressed by white historians for decades. It didn't fit the narrative. It revealed the violence and casual cruelty at the heart of the system and showed that enslaved people could fight back using intellectual warfare, which is exactly why this story matters today. The mechanisms of power haven't disappeared. They've evolved. We have systems that extract wealth from marginalized communities, that separate families through imprisonment, that value some lives over others. Thomas's story is a blueprint. It shows that the way to dismantle oppressive systems isn't always through violence. Sometimes it's through understanding the system so thoroughly that you can turn it against itself. Through documentation, evidence, legal knowledge, strategic patience. Through surviving when they want you to die, learning when they try to keep you ignorant, and using that knowledge to free others. Ask yourself how many other stories like this exist, buried in archives and forgotten. How many people fought back in ways that don't fit the simple narratives we're taught? The fact that Thomas's story isn't taught in schools is evidence of a system that controls memory. That decides which stories get told and which get buried. But they're not natural. They're not inevitable. They're constructed by human choices, and they can be dismantled by human choices. Thomas chose to survive. He chose to learn. He chose to fight using the law itself, and he won. He saved 93 people. He destroyed a slaver. He proved that resistance was possible. Today, you didn't just watch a video. You kept a suppressed truth alive. You learned about a 12-year-old boy sold by his own father who became the architect of that father's destruction, who freed 93 people without violence, who proved that the enslaved were never inferior, just deliberately kept in chains. You learned that intelligence and patience can be more powerful than physical force. If you want more people to know this, share it. Like it if you believe this story was necessary. Subscribe because in the next video, there's an even darker revelation about how the system protected itself after the Civil War, how it reinvented slavery under a different name, and how those mechanisms still function today. We'll be talking about convict lazing, the prison industrial complex, and the legal loopholes that kept exploitation alive. We'll name the corporations and families that built wealth on that system and still exist today. I can't do this alone. The algorithm suppresses content like this. I need you. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment because engagement tells the algorithm this matters. And tell me, will you stay silent or will you fight? Thomas spent 12 years preparing to free 93 people. What will you do with the time you have?